Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Hobbit Day 2022. This is a special broadcast to celebrate Hobbit Day. The very first thing I wanted to do this evening, after, of course, wishing Bilbo and Frodo a happy birthday, as always, is to explain what I'm not doing tonight. So many of you have been asking, because I know that normally for the last several years, many years actually, this night, Hobbit Day, has been the night on which we have launched our annual fundraising campaign for Signum University. I'm not doing that this year, and I wanted to explain why I wasn't doing that. Although, JJ, you are right, I'm not limiting the number of viewers to one gross here this evening. Thought we'd open that up, but anyway, so let me explain why we're not doing the. I'm pushing the fundraising campaign back. We're going to do that in November. Probably start at the very beginning of November and go through the 19th, I believe, is when I'm planning to do our traditional campaign ending webathon with the State of the University address and everything else. I'm pushing this back to November, mostly because, no, really entirely because this is a really busy month. This whole time right now is a really busy and chaotic time, and I want to be able to focus on things a little more, being able to focus on Signum a little bit more. There's so many competing things happening. Apart from the fact that, there's all this Rings of Power stuff and all these extra broadcasts and things that I'm doing in conjunction with that. But in addition, on top of that, there are 4 moots in the next 5 weeks here, from starting this weekend with Mountain Moot in Denver, all the way down through the Prancing Pony Moot, which is happening in Milwaukee on the 22nd of October, and then Middle Moot in Kansas City and New England Moot here in New Hampshire before that. So lots of things happening here in these next 6 months, and 6 weeks. Feels like 6 months. It'll be 6 weeks. And I was feeling increasingly, as we were getting closer and closer to the day, just that, if we tried to do our fundraising campaign during this sort of delightfully chaotic time, that it would get kind of pushed to the side, and I didn't want that to happen. So we decided we're gonna wait until November, when we can take a kind of deeper breath about things, and there are fewer conflicts going on, and then we'll be able to move forward with that. And so that means, so for instance, I've always done, every year we've done the campaign ever since 2013, I believe. I've done a Lord of the Rings online marathon. It's kind of it's been a traditional element of our fundraising campaign, and there's literally not a day on which I could schedule that between now and the normal end of our campaign, which is the end of the middle of October. And the traditional ending of the fundraising campaign just fell by coincidence, because, again, we've been doing this the same way every year for at least the last 9 years. And then, of course, it was announced that, as it so happens, the season finale of season 1 of the Rings of Power lines up right that weekend, and everything coming together all at once. I was just like, no, I don't want to do that. I don't want to do all that. I want to try to do all that. So, as I say, we're still gonna have our fundraising campaign as usual, but I'm gonna shift it forward to November instead of right now. So, normally, where I would be announcing the beginning of our campaign and telling you about our campaign theme and letting you know some of the exciting things that are happening, I'm not going to be doing that this evening. We'll be doing that later on, probably around Halloween instead. But I did want to do one thing, one sort of institutional thing before so there are 2 things that I wanted to do tonight. The one thing I wanted to do tonight is, we still should celebrate Bilbo and Frodo's birthday, of course. So we're going to have a little party here, and we're going to have a little Tolkien reading and discussion party for Hobbit Day, and we're going to talk about Hobbits. I want to do a discussion of Concerning Hobbits, not the entire thing, but more than you might think. That is, I'm not just going to do one paragraph. I'm going to do a number of paragraphs, 5 or 6 whole paragraphs of Concerning Hobbits. And hopefully we can answer the excellent question that my son Matthias asked about this, which is what exactly is so concerning about hobbits? But we're going to talk about concerning hobbits, and I'm going to be in that discussion. I'm looking forward to basically kind of bringing together the two things I've been thinking a lot about over these last couple months, and that is the very beginning of the Lord of the Rings and the Rings of Power. So we're going to read through and discuss Concerning Hobbits. I want to think about Tolkien's description of hobbits, the way that he chooses to give the background for hobbits. And I want to think about that in conjunction with what we see, especially at the beginning of the Fellowship of the Ring, in Hobbit culture in the Shire in the Third Age. And then I also want to think about that in connection with the Harfoots in the Rings of Power and how the show is kind of connecting to and playing with the stuff that we see, both about Shire culture and about and the stuff from Concerning Hobbits. So we're going to talk about both of those things later. But first, I wanted to do an update. As I said, one institutional thing I did want to do today because, as I announced a while back, we have launched our new Signum University Press. And our folks at the press have been working hard, and there's a lot of exciting stuff that is coming down the pike from the Signum University Press. And I wanted to make sure you guys found out about that. So I don't want to wait till November. Well, there'll be more stuff to talk about the press in November, but in the meantime, I wanted to let you guys know now some more stuff that's coming from the press. So I'm joined this evening by our editor-in-chief of the Signum University Press, Sørina Higgins. Hi, Sørina. How are you?
Hello, I'm very well. Thank you for having me here to give these updates.
Good. Hey, I had your picture and then I lost it. Oh, wait, it's coming back.
There it is.
There we are. Okay, excellent. Yeah, no, so glad to have you. So tell folks more about what's going on at the press. I know you guys have been a flurry of activity there.
We certainly have. I and my amazing team have been working hard to build this airplane while it is in flight.
Exactly.
So we're happy to share with people some things that are going on. Could I have screen sharing?
Oh, sure.
Here so I can show some shiny new things.
Sure.
I think the most exciting thing is how the press is trying to promote the overall vision and mission that the university itself does, which is to make so much more learning, education, research, academic materials available to the general public and more accessible to more people. Mm-hmm. And we're doing this through a bunch of different ways. As you know, we're doing this through the methods of distribution, right? So we're going to have our works exist in a variety of different modes. So audiobooks, digital e-texts, and printed books on paper, making our academic works more affordable than they are through traditional university presses.
Yes.
Very important point. And also through having scholarship written for a wider audience and creative works as well. So this is the shiny new Signum University Press page, and I'll get back to some of these other tabs that we have in a minute. But we also have fresh, exciting new reveal. We have our social media pages. So we would love it if everybody would go and follow on Twitter and like on Facebook, where you'll get updates about the things that we are releasing, the books that are coming along, how you can order or even pre-order those, when there are author events and things of that nature. So we'd really love everybody to check that out. So I will get in a few minutes into some specific projects, but I just want to make sure that everybody who's watching tonight knows what they can do at the moment. As I said, can follow and like our social media pages to get updates. You can also submit work to us. And here is the submissions page on the press website. We're looking for 3 different types of work. Straight up academic, peer-reviewed scholarship, as one would expect from a university press. Popular scholarship that you'll probably talk about a little bit more in a minute, right, Corey?
Yep.
And also literary creative projects, poetry, fiction, creative nonfiction, things that are hard to categorize. So if anyone who's watching or listening to this has work that you've written that you'd like us to consider, here are the instructions for how to submit. And especially, we have some very particular types of work that we're looking for right now to fill some gaps in our catalog. So I'm sure everybody is like, well, what are you talking about? What are you going to be publishing? What are you going to be releasing? So would you like to start us off with that, Corey? And then I'll follow with some other projects that we have coming along?
Sure. So, of course, the first thing that I announced a while back is my next book, Exploring the Lord of the Rings. So, and we can talk a little bit about that. Now, the first thing I have to confess about that is I warned people at the time that there was a chance that we would encounter delays, and we have. And the delay there is so what we're doing is a new thing. So let me actually first talk about the new thing, and then I'll talk more about the delay. So the new thing, of course, that we're doing with my book, and I know, Sørina, we plan to do this with a bunch of our books that we do, is progressive release of our books. So as Sørina was saying, we want to make these more not just more accessible in terms of like having the final products of the press more accessible, but to have people more engaged and involved in the entire process. I mean, I think it's going to be really, really fun, really cool if the Signum Press is not just like, we're the people who deliver things to you and you take them and go read them, right? But for this actually to be a more actively engaged community of scholars and readers. There's so much more. Again, there's so many things that I think, when we think about how, like, what the role of a printing press was in like the 18th century, what it was in the 20th century and what it can be now. There are a lot of ways in which things are different. So one of the things... It can
be a more living and back and forth relationship, right? It can be accessible in the sense of the author being accessible to the readers whenever possible as well.
Exactly. So what we're doing, so with my book, for instance, I'm not just going to say like, hey, I'm planning to write a book, come back in like a year or two and that book will be finished, right? Instead, I am writing it now, and I'm going to be releasing it chapter by chapter. And so people who buy the book in advance will be able to get the chapters as they come out. You can join my author circle, which is a group which I meet with every month to kind of talk with them about what I've been working on, get feedback from them on the book that, on the works, the things that I'm working on. It might be one book, it might be more than one project. And so therefore have this kind of more interactive opportunity to be involved. And then, of course, at the end, when everything is done, there will be a final, product that's then published afterwards. But really, it's about the journey as much as the destination when it comes to that. So the cause for one of the causes for the delay is that, of course, my book and several of the books that we're working on are involved with Tolkien. And for people who don't know anything about how this works in the publication process, in order to publish a work like my book on The Hobbit and like my book on The Lord of the Rings, where I'm quoting a lot from the text, you have to have permission for that. You have to get permission from the copyright holder of the book to do that. This is true of all scholarly works. Like, some people have said to me, like, well, if you're just... Isn't it fair use if you're just quoting in order to discuss? No. Answer no. It's the simple answer to that. Right. You do have to get permissions from the copyright holding estate when you're quoting a book that's not in. So we have been in discussion with HarperCollins, which are still ongoing. I know one of the things that kind of is, I think, perhaps slowing those conversations down is the fact that we are doing something quite new, right? What we're discussing with them, what we're proposing for the release patterns and things of my book is not something that fits into the normal categories of what they've done. And so it's sort of
Charles Dickens meets the Twitter era, right?
Exactly.
Release chapter by chapter.
Right. Yeah. So it's it's with the Dickens example. It's not like this is wholly unknown in the history of publication, and yet it's not exactly what Dickens did either. So,
you don't have people lining up on the docks in Boston?
Not yet, but I'm sure that'll come, eventually. But no, anyway. So we're gonna. So we're in continuing discussions with that, and we can't release the first chapters until we have finalized everything with HarperCollins and the Tolkien estate. So we'll continue working on that. And in the meantime, I've been writing, and I've been having a wonderful time digging back into things. One of the things I'll share about this that has been really fun. So I was judging what sort of progress I thought. What progress I thought I was going to be making. I was judging that based on writing my Hobbit book. My Hobbit book is about 80,000 words, and there are 20 chapters in The Hobbit, so, average of about 4,000 words per chapter or so as I was going through The Hobbit. And so that's kind of like the picture I had in my mind, right? When I'm like, okay, right, so I'll write about, a chapter a month, that shouldn't be too hard. And I started writing chapter 1 of this book, and I'm like, man, this is taking me forever. Like, why is this taking me so long to write this chapter? And then I realized that I was like, no more than 2/3 of the way through this chapter at most. And I'd already written like 8,500 words for this. And I'm like, oh, it's because this chapter is like 3 times as long, 3 to 4 times as long as my Hobbit chapters. That would be why this is taking me so much longer to write. I've already written the equivalent of like 2 chapters from my Hobbit book. And this, of course, is hardly surprising at all. The Lord of the Rings is, of course, a very different kind of book from The Hobbit. The chapters themselves are very much longer than the Hobbit chapters are. And there's a lot more going on in there. So as I was going through, so as I've been writing on The Long Expected Party, I've definitely been having that sort of sorry, not sorry feeling about the length of the chapter. Like there's a lot to talk about and a lot to say. So I think I'm going to end up doing, my original plan, of course, had been 1 chapter per chapter, basically. And I think that's because it could be like a novella per chapter, and that's just not gonna work. So I think we're gonna subdivide it. Right now I'm actually planning 3 chapters on chapter 1. So I'm kind of finishing up the new organizational structure of what is now going to be the first 3 chapters, and fleshing out some final points for that. So that's what I'm in the middle of doing right now.
It's not surprising. Tolkien developed as a writer between The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, and you've developed as a writer in the decades since your Hobbit book.
Yeah, exactly. There are definitely some different things, and so it's going to be, so what this means is that there's going to be much more of my book than I thought there was going to be, and that'll be fun. But yeah, Astro, it's true. I think a lot of people have often misunderstood this. Copyright consent has always been required for quotes in academic work, as long as the thing you're writing on is in copyright. Of course, it's not something like medievalists, for instance, run into all that often, but it's fortunately the Chaucer estate isn't still around, selling permissions for quoting Chaucer, but it's been a normal thing for a very long time for scholarly works,
and we're definitely pleased to be working with them and cultivating a good relationship and going back and forth on this to make sure that all is well.
And that's why the delay. We want to make sure that we do this properly, and we're really working hard to establish a positive relationship there, because of course we're hoping for to be publishing a great deal of Tolkien material, and we really we're definitely wanting that to be a positive relationship. So anyway, so that's the cause for the immediate delay of why haven't been able to release chapter 1 yet. And a little bit more about sort of what's coming, what I'm working on now and what's been coming with my book. But Sørina, tell us about some of the other things that are coming up.
Sure. Well, while we're on the topic of Tolkien-related things, I'm very pleased that we are going to be printing an expanded, I guess you could call it, second edition of Jeff LaSala's Silmarillion Primer, which he first released on Tor.com. And we're going through that now and editing that and expanding that, working with some artists. So that should be an absolutely lovely work. Again, it will be released in all of those formats, but many people, I'm sure, would love to have the paper volume when it's done, put it on the shelf next to their Silmarillion, can be going back and forth between the two. So I'm very pleased to be working with Jeff on that.
Yeah, the Silmarillion Primer is really great, and it's such a wonderful concept. And he's, the first version that he published on Tor.com is executed so well. It's really a beautiful way to kind of bring people into the Silmarillion, and I'm really looking forward to seeing the, as you say, the sort of expanded edition there.
I just love his tone in it and the way that he's so playful about Tolkien while also, respecting every word and every phrase and unpacking it. in a really lighthearted way that can invite in a lot of different readers, but bringing all that great knowledge to it. And then hopefully we will have a short, handy guide to the Second Age, which would be really nice to have at some point during this whole Rings of Power adventure, so that people can have another nice thing on their shelves to pull off when they're watching the show and say, wait a minute, is that in the lore? And have something to look up. And that would be by two of our faculty, James Tauber and Elise Trudell-Cedeno.
Exactly. Yeah. James and Elise, I know, have been teaching space modules on the Second Age now for several months, and that's been really cool. But yeah, I mean, it's the thing about Second Age stuff is that it's scattered all over the place, right? I mean, like, even if you have all of the books, right, you've got to like pick through 5 or 6 different volumes to look up like the particular thing. So a place to be able to gather all this stuff together and kind of walk people through, here's like what Tolkien wrote about the Second Age, going to be really, really handy.
Just bring it all together in that one nice place. So those are the Tolkien-related things that we have. But of course, we are interested in all kinds of other literature and topics here. Some are related more or less so. I'm excited about our first academic peer-reviewed project, which is a collection of student essays from Signum students in our 3 different courses related to the Arthurian legends. So a King Arthur study, and it will cover works from Tennyson until now. So it's sort of the return of King Arthur after his heyday in the Middle Ages. So it'll be, I'm almost thinking of it kind of like a sequel to the Inklings and King Arthur, because it will follow along so nicely after that. There are a few chapters that touch on the Inklings, inevitably, when you're looking at 20th century Arthuriana. But we bring such a wide range of critical viewpoints into this volume. It's looking at these works from perspectives that have rarely been done before, and some that have, but on different texts, so gender studies approaches and new historicist approaches, but then we also have a geocritical lens, and one looking at neurodiversity, and one that's using digital humanities methods to do text mining and show what that can open up.
Yeah, this is such a cool project because we've had many of our Signum students, like a whole bunch of papers that have been written in Signum courses have ended up getting published here and there in lots of places, and of course we've done 3 now Arthurian courses within our MA program, so we have this large sort of body of work that students have been doing in thinking about Arthur. Most recently, Gabriel Schenk's Return of King Arthur course about the modern adaptations of Arthur. And anyway, so I being able to kind of bring all that stuff together and to publish it in the press, I think is going to be really, really cool.
We're so proud of our students, and really glad to highlight their work in this way and show the great diversity of perspectives they have. We will have a couple of different lecture series that we'll present as well, because it's not all just written materials. Dr. Faith Acker is looking into doing a series on exploring Shakespeare's sonnets, and I hope that she will do kind of the Corey Olsen method, where she'll do a whole lecture on each sonnet, but we shall see. I mean, one can absolutely do that. Those are just rich little
for
jewels,
sure,
absolutely packed. And she brings a great, historical and cultural context lens to that work. Really exciting. And a similar one from Mike Drought, exploring Beowulf, and I think he wants to do a line by line translation and gloss and discussion.
Yeah, that's what he talked about. What he told me is like, I wanna just put out there everything I know about Beowulf, and I'm like, okay, that's good.
We better start and get going, because he knows a great deal about Beowulf.
So exactly, he was talking about going through line by line and basically looking at like a couple different things at once, right? Looking at talking about the story as it develops, of course, and thinking about the poetics and how it goes, and like literary or like linguistic questions as well, talking about each of because there's so many places in Beowulf, especially because it's a unique text, right? We have more than usual number of like words
textual cruxes.
Textual, words that people don't understand and debate about,
literal
and all these
holes
things.
In the manuscript.
Literal holes in the manuscript, and exactly all that kind of stuff. So Mike's going to be going through. I don't know if it's literally line by line. It'll be sentence by sentence, perhaps. But anyway, he'll be going through just a couple lines at a time through the entire work, and that's going to be really, really Cool. So yeah, he's going to be doing audio discussions through that. Yeah.
Right. And he's actually one of a couple authors that are doing more than one project for us. And his second project is a book that he's written, A Defense of the Liberal Arts. They teach you how to think and why the study of humanities is so important right now. Another scholar from whom we have two works, and this is utterly delightful, is the great Verlyn Flieger.
Yes.
And we have two projects we're working with her simultaneously in quite different genres, quite different media. And one is a collection of short stories. She's one of these many academics that, one of these English professors who then writes her own works of literature. Yeah. So she has a collection of short stories. They range from stories for very young children, delightful little tales for kids, through retellings and adaptations, up to some really fascinating, speculative, and even dark stories that she provides in this volume. Yeah. And also a series of interviews with her, a retrospective, thinking back over her career as a Tolkien scholar and a medievalist. And we're really delighted to be producing those.
Yes.
I hope to have those before too long.
Oh man, this collection of videos, this collection of interviews that we're going to be doing with Dr. Flieger, I'm so excited for this to exist, right? There are so many things that that so many of us in so many different ways can learn from her and her experience that she's had. And man, she is one of those people who is just so delightful to talk to and, to hear her stories and everything. And I'm so excited we're going to get the chance to share those with people.
Me too. And then there are other works further down in the future, but the other one that's coming up more quickly is a revised second edition of K. Ben Abraham's beautiful novel, The Flower of the Cedar. Yes. So some of you may have listened to that as a podcast or even purchased the first edition when it came out. So I'm happy to be working with her to revise that book, taking into account some of the feedback she got from her original readers. She's also is interested in doing an author's circle, as you described, Corey, where she'll be available to meet with people and get feedback right away on the book as it's in progress. Because this whole serial release model that we're talking about, I love how symbiotic it is and back and forth, because the work will not be finally officially published, Library of Congress and ISBN, et cetera, until after that whole process. So it enables people to give feedback that really can make its way right into the text of the work. So it's a wonderful way of bringing the community into that. So those are the things that we have at some point in the near future, but hopefully folks who are listening noticed maybe a gap in our catalog and said, hey, I have something. I'm particularly interested right now in academic works that will go through the peer review process and in individual short stories. Another gorgeous benefit of the serial release model is we could release one short story a month until we notice that we have, we have 8 stories in this genre or on yes. this topic, and then we can put them together into a collected.
Yeah, there's so many ways in which I think we have the ability to kind of bend normal definitions, right? Instead of being like, we must, gather stories for a collection which has like enough heft to sit on a shelf or whatever. We have the ability to be a lot more flexible about like that. I really
right. It's sort of the reverse of the usual. The usual is to put out a call for submissions on a certain, we would like space opera stories about sentient machines, please. And then once we get enough of the good quality on that theme, we put a volume together. But here, we will see what comes in. And hey, if we have 8 stories about sentient machines,
there's a volume
will follow.
Exactly.
And then, world domination by these creatures, and that's the end of all things. And look what we've done. But anyway.
Right. But fortunately, if they're going to take over the world, they'll probably figure that out without our volume of short stories. So it'll be good.
But who knows? Maybe they'll even do a better job than we are.
You can't rule it out. Yeah. I've always wondered why there aren't more stories like that, right? Like the day the machines took over, and then actually things were much better after that. Right? It's always so depressing when the machines take over.
Because who painted the lion, right?
Exactly. Right. Tell me who. Yes. Exactly. Exactly. Well, ending on a little wife of Bath quote is a great way to finish.
Yeah,
No, I
we
mean
can
you
do
just
that.
ended on a wife of Bath quote.
I thought I would give a shout out to my awesome staff, and then I will get out of your way so that you can do some more Hobbit celebration. But I'm blessed to have just a marvelous team that I'm working with. Kira Trigoning, who has been doing a ton of organizing the way that we run projects and social media and all of that, and also editorial. Nick Palazzo, who is a multi-talented, can do all kinds of video editing and production stuff, but also editorial and communications, and just so many skills there. James Tauber, who is designing our custom software for distributing the works. Christopher Bartlett is going to be taking over the audiobook side of things, and also is a wizard with things that have to do with contracts and compliance and finances, etc. Sarah Monier, who is also has a sharp editorial eye, has joined our team recently, and Giovanna Chinelato, who's jumping on board and going to do some website stuff. So just a marvelous team. We have a delightful time talking about all these things. And so if anybody here submits a work, it will be in good hands.
Excellent. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Sørina, for all the work that you've been doing on this. And I know people are going to be very excited about the stuff, and there's so much more to come. From the Signum University Press and Signum Studios, because we started with a few ideas for some video things we might do, and that's been kind of growing on its own there as well. So much more to be talked about there too as well soon.
Yeah, it's great to be collaborating with Maggie over on the studios and figuring out how to do these things that have video and audio components.
Yeah, absolutely. Cool. So thank you so much for joining us and for telling us about the exciting things to come. And we'll get more from you. We'll get another update from you later on.
All right. Thanks. Enjoy the rest of the birthday party.
Okay. Thank you. Awesome. Yeah. So it is... I'm so excited about the things that are coming from the press. I know that in a lot of ways, I've come across this when talking about my book with people after I've been announcing it and everything. And I can tell a lot of, we're kind of breaking a lot of categories with this. We're doing things pretty differently from how they've been done before. I know a lot of people have, taken a while to adjust to that. Like people have been having a hard time figuring out, like, wait a second, like how are you doing the book? When is it being released? And it's been I think hard for people to get used to the idea. But there's so many new things, so many different ways that we're going to be doing stuff, and I think it's going to be really, really exciting. Can't wait. The Verlin Flieger video is something we've been talking about a very great deal. Lots and lots of excitement about that, because she is just somebody she's been one of our favorite people at Signum for a long time, from the very, very beginning. Those of you who were around for Signum's very, very first course in the fall of 2011 will remember her guest lecturing in that very first course, along with Tom Shippey and Michael Drought. I'm just enormously excited to see the Flieger interviews are going to be amazing. So anyway, we're getting all that stuff worked. And I did, again, just want to mention, especially with, you guys know about the partnership that we have developed with Studio Lab New Hampshire, up here in Derry, where Maggie and I have been producing Rings and Realms for the last few months, and that has really kind of taken off, and all of us have become really excited about that partnership. So yeah, we're actually moving forward with Signum Studios. We're going to have we're doing a production studio of our own. Again, it's going to be done a great deal of that in partnership with Studio Lab, and we're working out with some of their folks to collaborate with us on the Verlin Flieger video and several other things that we're doing. Maggie Park, my Rings and Realms and Other Minds and Hands partner, is going to be directing the Signum Studios and sort of our executive producer on all of these projects. So we will have some more exciting announcements about more video projects that are going to be coming out of that soon as well, because again, there's a lot going on behind the scenes there. So anyway, those are the fun announcements. Now let us get into Discussion. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to get rid of that. Okay, and I'm going to turn myself on over here instead. Okay, there we go. Excellent. Excellent. So I should be able to shift gears here. Okay. All right. Let's talk about Hobbit. So it's time for our Hobbit Day reading and discussion. So let's figure out why hobbits are concerning. All right. Here's how. So remember the context of Concerning Hobbits in the So this is all from the prologue of the Fellowship of the Ring, right? And so this is information that Tolkien had, or that Tolkien was giving, to set people up for the Fellowship of the Ring, right? And this was in part because he, couldn't take for granted that everybody had read The Hobbit first, which is why, of course, you'll remember this introductory section, this prologue, the prologue of the Fellowship of the Ring, also includes a synopsis of The Hobbit, right? Just in case people haven't read it. So the self-conscious project so Tolkien is not just like doing random world building here, right? I mean, he is doing random world building here, but he's not just doing random world building here. He is deliberately setting his readers up for what they're going to receive, not just generally in the Lord of the Rings, but in Chapter 1 in particular. It's actually, so I've been, for those of you who are fans of the Prancing Pony podcast, which I know many of you are because it's awesome. I've been, all of you guys know Sean Marchese was not able to continue with the Prancing Pony. He had to step down from the Prancing Pony podcast this year. And so Alan has been bringing in many guest co-hosts who are coming in shifts during the course of this year. And I'm taking the first shift. So I'm co-hosting with Alan the Prancing Pony podcast for the next 4 episodes. So the first one that he and I did together is going to drop this coming Sunday. This coming Sunday's episode will be our first one. And it's going to be a Questions After Nightfall. And then we're going to do the first 3 episodes of Chapter 1, the Chapter 1 discussion from Book 5. Anyway, so he and I were just recording the third of the 4 episodes that I'm going to do with Alan last night. And one of the questions from Barrowman's mailbag that we were discussing was about the synopses, like the synopsis that Tolkien wrote to be produced at the beginning of the Two Towers, and another one that he wrote that was released at the beginning of the Return of the King. And what the sharp-eyed reader was noticing was that there's actually spoilers in those synopses, and which is true. And what our discussion of those synopses was really kind of forcing me to think through, which I'd never really thought through before, was the way in which Tolkien goes about setting people up for what they're about to read, for where they start. And one of the things that he does is he tends to give you stuff that you don't just get. Right. He wants you to be thinking about these particular things in advance. He is much more likely to give you a spoiler, to tell you something in advance so that you can be thinking about it and prepared for it when it comes. Right. He's much more likely to do that than he is likely to just tease stuff which will be dramatically revealed later on. That's just generally not how Tolkien rolls almost ever. So I wanted to think about I want to think about these passages. And I'm not going to talk about this in nearly as much detail as I do in exploring the Lord of the Rings. But I wanted to think through this in 2 different ways, as I mentioned at the beginning of the broadcast. I want to talk about this in conjunction with Chapter 1 of the Fellowship of the Ring specifically. How is he preparing us for Chapter 1? What do we see here that helps to put us in the frame of mind that he wants us to be in concerning hobbits, right? Concerning hobbits and the Shire, when we start Chapter 1, right? And then the second thing I want to do is I want to think about the depiction of the Harfoots in the Rings of Power show, and I want to look at how they in the opening of that show, because of course we've only seen the Harfoots in 3 episodes so far at the time of recording this episode. How are we being, how is what he describes about hobbits here, how does that relate to what we see from the Harfoots at the beginning of their depiction in the show? I'm going to try not to bounce back and forth. I'm going to try to do those two things separately. But anyway, that's what I'm going to do. And as I said before, this is for me kind of bringing together into one place the two things I'm spending a lot of time thinking about these days. On the one hand, I'm, as I mentioned just a little while back, I'm in the middle of finishing up what I thought was going to be chapter 1 of my book, but what has turned out to be the first 3 chapters of my book, on the long expected party. And then also at the same time, I've been doing a lot of thinking and talking about the Rings of Power show. And so I want to, in thinking about hobbits here on Hobbit Day, I want to talk about both. So let's read a little bit. The very first thing, after his little preamble in which he tells us what he's going to do, here's how Tolkien chooses to begin telling people. Remember, our presumed audience here are people who don't know anything at all about hobbits. Maybe they've read The Hobbit, maybe they've not read The Hobbit, right? But they're sort of not supposed to have read The Lord of the Rings before, right? So try, if we can, to come at this imaginatively with a clean slate. Hobbits are an unobtrusive but very ancient people, more numerous formerly than they are today, for they love peace and quiet and good-tilled earth. A well-ordered and well-farmed countryside was their favorite haunt. They do not and did not understand or like machines more complicated than a forge bellows, a watermill, or a hand loom, though they were skillful with tools. Even in ancient days, they were, as a rule, shy of the big folk, as they call us, and now they avoid us with dismay and are becoming hard to find. They are quick of hearing and sharp-eyed, and though they are inclined to be fat and do not hurry unnecessarily, they are nonetheless nimble and deft in their movements. They possessed from the first the art of disappearing swiftly and silently when large folk whom they do not wish to meet come blundering by, and this art they have developed until to men it may seem magical. But hobbits have never, in fact, studied magic of any kind, and their elusiveness is due solely to a professional skill that heredity and practice, and a close friendship with the earth, have rendered inimitable by bigger and clumsier races. All right, so where do we start? Where does Tolkien start with hobbits? Unobtrusive, but very ancient. Okay, they're unobtrusive, but very ancient. One thing that I am so struck by when I read through this paragraph, arguably what I'm about to say is the opposite of what I said, let's come at this with a clean slate. And this is coming to a Tolkien thing with about as unclean a slate as possible. But consider it an aside, and then we'll get back to the clean slate look. I just can't help but think of where Tolkien started in his whole literary career, right? What inspired Tolkien to sit down and write stories in the first place, right? And the answer to that seems to be elves, right? And what even does that mean, elves, right? I mean fairy tales, fairy stories. If you read especially his early poetry of the 1920s, 19 teens especially, 19 teens and then to some extent the 1920s, think poems like Cortirion Among the Trees, which you can read in The Adventures of Tom Bombadil, Goblin Feet, which he wanted to have burned, his first Arundel, not exactly Arundel, but his first Mariner poem. A lot of that early poetry is inspired by the idea that in the ancient days there were these special, I was about to say magical, but not necessarily. He resists the idea of elves and elves being magical in some ways too, or at least of using that word to describe them. That there was this other special race of beings that dwelt among us, or at least dwell where we now dwell. And the land still remembers them, and we can still sometimes, occasionally people will still encounter them, or at least encounter like memories of them. Maybe you'll hear something, maybe you'll feel something, maybe you'll see something that you can't explain. This idea that there lingers into the modern era a memory of fairies, and of fairy, and that sometimes humans can wander into fairy, which is, of course, the realm where fairies live. Elf and fairy are synonyms in Tolkien's vocabulary. It's the same. They're exactly the same thing. Anyway, so that concept of going to, like, how he would, like, go to a place, right, in England. You can see a bunch of his early poetry is like from his time in Warwick, in Warwickshire. Anyway, so he'd go to these places, and they would feel this. It would have this sense of wonder, this sense of presence, right? And he would write a poem about, about the ancient fairies, who are not there anymore or whatever. Notice the parallels, right? Notice the parallels to that whole sort of elf fairy concept that he started his career with, and where he brings hobbits in here, 4 decades later, right? That they're a very ancient people. Hobbits have been around for a very, very long time, but they're unobtrusive. They were always unobtrusive, right? And now, even in ancient days, they were shy of the big folk, and now they avoid us with dismay and are becoming hard to find. They're still around, apparently, right? So the concept of this prologue here is that hobbits still exist in the modern world, but you're unlikely to see one because they're awful hard to find. And they avoid us actively with dismay. But maybe, who knows, maybe if you're very lucky and very careful, you might perhaps stumble across or see a hobbit at some point. That's the concept that he writes in here, and I find it fascinating. But anyway, okay, back to my clean slate view. Knowing nothing about Tolkien's literary career. What else do we know about them? So, unobtrusive is the very first thing that we're told about them. He then gets back to them avoiding us, as I just was mentioning. They possessed from the first the art of disappearing swiftly and silently when large folk whom they do not wish to meet come blundering by, such that this seems magical to us, right? Though he insists they don't study magic, right? It's not magical. It's just practice, heredity practice, of this professional skill. I believe, by the way, that the word professional there seems to be a Bilbo reference, right? The idea of him being a professional burglar. Remember, and again, here I am going against the clean slate thing. Remember in the Quest of Erebor, Gandalf talking to Thorin that what he needs is stealth, professional stealth, right? And that word professional really jumps out at Thorin and becomes an important element of the story. And here it is, again, that same word professional brought in. So they have a kind of stealth that is inimitable, unable to be imitated by bigger and clumsier races, right? We just can't possibly hide ourselves like they do. So the unobtrusiveness of the hobbits is the most important thing. But notice that there are many other elements just in this paragraph alone that are in tension with that. You notice that? He doesn't just... So having established all the way through, right, beginning, middle, and end of this paragraph, that the very first characteristic he wants to emphasize about hobbits is their stealth, and how easily they can hide and how quickly they can vanish. He then also tells us that they love peace and quiet in good-tilled earth. Good-tilled earth. Like they're farmers. Hard to hide a farm, isn't it? A little hard to hide a farm? Your farmer may vanish, but how's he going to hide his turnip patch? You know what I mean? They did not understand machines more complicated than a forge bellows, a water mill, or a hand loom. a blacksmith's forge, a watermill, and a loom. All three of those, not real easy to hide. Those are all three very large, stationary, difficult to move tools, right? If you've got a watermill, you're staying put, right? I mean, it's possible to have a portable forge or to have a portable loom even. Awkward. And they have to be quite small ones, right? So there's a lot of things you couldn't do with them. It wouldn't be fully functional, but you can do something like that. But a watermill? I don't know about that, right? So again, all of those things that he's just told us in these two sentences, that they till the earth, right? And that they have all these very large, heavy, and difficult to move machines, suggests that they're sort of rooted and settled down, as opposed to ephemeral, right? And quick to vanish. And then once again, we hear that about their, we hear about their persons as well, right? They're inclined to be fat and do not hurry unnecessarily. Right? So they're, do not hurry unnecessarily. I think that's a sort of a teasing remark. I think that translates to lazy, right? They tend to be lazy. Do not hurry unnecessarily, I think, is a kind of comical roundabout way of saying that, especially when it is accompanied by inclined to be fat, right? So we have these fat, unhurried hobbits, right? Who farm the land, make forge bellows, water mills, and hand looms, and yet at the same time are extremely elusive and very difficult to find, right? So that kind of tension, I think, is really interesting here. And when we think about this as a setup for chapter 1, there's no evidence of elusiveness in the Shire as a whole. The Shire is not elusive. I mean, a lot of people don't know where it is, or not many people have heard of it because most people don't care. But that's not because if you go there, it'll vanish or something, or be difficult to enter or anything, right? The dwarves know just where it is. They might not think much of its inhabitants, right? They might think them cowardly and boring, as Thorin seems to, again, in the Quest of Erebor. But he's not going to, they don't consider them particularly, as I say, elusive or difficult to find at that point. So it's now, obviously, we've got the setup for Bilbo and his adventure and the finding of the ring, of course. Yeah, exactly, Autoflagellator. They live on a major trade route. It is hard to miss. It absolutely is. It absolutely is. And I did want to encourage you, feel free to make comments as we go along. Y'all have been very polite and very quiet on the comments here, but you can feel free to make comments, and I can respond to your observations as we go. Yeah, JJ, you're right. The dwarves think them boring, which is a very boring thing to think. No doubt. No doubt. Okay, so we'll see where we go forward from this first paragraph. But that kind of I don't know if it's two sides of the Hobbits, or there's two different things that are emphasized in this paragraph are pretty interesting. All right. The second thing we're told, paragraph 2 of the description, for they are a little people, smaller than dwarves, less stout and stocky, that is, even when they are not actually much shorter. Their height is variable, ranging between 2 and 4 feet of our measure. They seldom now reach 3 feet, but they have dwindled, they say, and in ancient days they were taller. According to the Red Book, Bandobras Took, Bolrorer, son of Izumbras III, was 4'5" and able to ride a horse. He was surpassed in all Hobbit records only by 2 famous characters of old, but that curious matter is dealt with in this book. Notice spoiler there, right? Now it's a slightly concealed spoiler in that it doesn't name Merry and Pippin explicitly, right? But as in the course of the book themselves, they are going to mention trying to beat the bull roarer. The fact that they succeed in doing so has already been spoiled here at the very beginning. So Meow, do we think hobbits were always sneaky and quiet? Well, that's what we're told here, that it's apparently like a signature thing about them. Let me address for a second the slightly complicated question of, did Tolkien invent hobbits? Answer, yes, in the sense that he's not dealing with a well-established tradition like he was with elves, right? When he was telling stories about the elves, he was speaking into a long tradition of fairy stories, in which he was trying to emphasize some elements and was trying to move away from other elements of the fairy tradition, the fairy story tradition. And with dwarves as well, same kind of thing. Those were a well-established thing. Hobbits were not a well-established thing. However, there are definitely precedents for it. The most obvious one is in a book that we knew that Tolkien had and his children loved, which was a book called The Marvelous Land of Snurgs. And the Snurgs, S-N-E-R-G, the Snurgs are a little people like hobbits. They're a diminutive humanoid race who are like hobbits in some ways, not in all ways, but there's certainly a similarity. It's hard to imagine that the Marvelous Land of Snurgs did not exert any influence on Tolkien and The Hobbit. But at the same time, he's not just taking that either. He's not just, and he's certainly not kind of appealing to that openly as sort of part of the tradition. It is a really fun book. Yeah, it's available on Audible. If you haven't read The Marvelous Land of Snurgs, you should. It has, in my opinion, the best moral of any book of its era. So it was written in the 1920s, and this was still a time where a lot of children's books had an explicit moral at the end. And the moral of this story is, right, there's a moral at the end of The Marvelous Land of Snurgs, and it is my favorite moral written at the end of any story that I know of. So good. So good. I haven't laughed that hard in a long time. When I read the moral of The Marvelous Land of Snurgs. But anyhow, so yeah, great book. And no, I can't tell you because it's like you have to read it to get it. Like it's not quoted in isolation. It's not gonna have anything like the impact. You just trust me. Read the book. Moral's awesome. Anyhow, so functionally, Tolkien was making hobbits up from scratch. Again, he was not appealing to a tradition. This was not a standard thing at all. This was not a normal category. So this is one of the reasons why he's writing this whole section, is because he knows that hobbits, the concept of hobbits, is not a thing that people are just going to be, oh yeah, well obviously, right? It's a hobbit story. Like if you were to tell a story about dwarves, you don't have to explain, what is a dwarf? Well, dwarves are short and tend to be bearded and have Scottish accents. You don't have to explain that. Everybody knows, right? But with hobbits, he certainly did have to explain that. There you go. I haven't seen the Stephen Fry reading. That's great. It wasn't on Audible last I checked, which was many years ago. So I'm going to have to get the Stephen Fry reading. He's a wonderful audiobook reader. Love Stephen Fry's reading in general. So yeah, there you go. 6 hours long. Okay, so they're short. The variability of their height, that's an enormous range. From 2 to 4 feet in height. So there are some hobbits out there that are half the size of other hobbits. That's really remarkable. you don't normally see that kind of variation. And I would add, nor do we see any evidence within the narrative itself that we have that much variation, right? Even when Merry and Pippin get tall over the course of the story, it's not, they don't grow a foot and a half. You know, when Sam is commenting on their height in The Return of the King, you know, he has to like line them up next to each other to double check, right? It's not like he takes one look at them and he's like, holy cow, you're 2 feet taller than I am, right? Like it's not like that at all. Meow, you're right. It is interesting that Tolkien emphasizes the shortness of them in this opening paragraph, and yet Merry and Pippin seem to value being tall in that they're trying to beat the bull roarer, right? Now, I don't think that necessarily reflects a general Hobbit like passion for that, like relative height matters a great deal among them, and so therefore being the tallest is the most awesome. I don't see much evidence of that. Indeed, Pippin's response about his height when he tells Birgil how tall he is, it doesn't sound like that's particularly what he is invested in, right? He doesn't seem to care or be self-conscious about his height. Anyway, yeah. Aslan's Compass, I hear you. Like Olympic gymnasts standing next to Olympic basketball players. Yes, but I don't think that's what he's talking about here. I mean, so you can technically say that, modern human height varies a very great deal, and that's certainly true. But if you're just describing a population of people, that is to say, the Olympic gymnast and the Olympic basketball player are extreme ends of the height spectrum in either direction, right? I don't think that's. It's not like if you go to if you're describing like your average humans, right? You're not going to be talking about Olympic gymnasts and Olympic basketball players necessarily. Right, and I agree, JJ. I don't think that beating the bull roarer was like their goal from the start, right? That it was just a joke reacting to the comment on their height. Yeah, I agree. And Starsha, I do think it likely that particular families may have strong height trends, right? That there may be some, like, it's hard for me to imagine that like within one family, you're going to have like one kid who's like 2'2" and another kid who's like 3'11", right? But it does seem quite possible that you might have like the Tooks as a family might be a quite different height than say the Bolgers as a family, right? I do think that's possible. Okay. Anyway, all right. Okay, so we've got their elusiveness combined with emphasizing their apparent domesticity and agrarian culture in the first paragraph, and then we get the height in the second paragraph. Then we've got, as for the hobbits of the Shire, with whom these tales are concerned, in the days of their peace and prosperity, they were a merry folk. They dressed in bright colours, being notably fond of yellow and green, but they seldom wore shoes, since their feet had tough leathery soles and were clad in a thick curling hair, much like the hair of their heads, which was commonly brown. Thus the only craft little practised among them was shoemaking, but they had long and skilful fingers, and could make many other useful and comely things. Their faces were as a rule good-natured rather than beautiful, broad, bright-eyed, red-cheeked, with mouths apt to laughter and to eating and drinking. And laugh they did, and eat, and drink, often and heartily, being fond of simple jests at all times, and 6 meals a day, when they could get them. They were hospitable, and delighted in parties, and in presents, which they gave away freely, and eagerly accepted. So, the, 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 lots of sort of social information, right? And this is telling us about them in the days of their peace and prosperity. They were a merry folk. Meow says, is this possibly the most detailed description of all the humanoids of Middle-earth? It's up there. It's up there. We don't get too much more than this for most people, for sure, in Tolkien. Being notably fond of yellow and green. They dressed in bright colors, being notably fond of yellow and green. So you can see one thing that clearly is practiced among them is dyeing, right? That is dyeing clothes, not perishing. But bright colors in clothing don't come natural in, fibers that are used to make clothing. If you don't have lots of materials to make brightly colored dyes, which apparently they do. Yes, so their feet. Yes. I also note that they don't have enormous, long, rubbery feet. That is such a lamentable tradition. Really lamentable. More on Hobbit feet, though. Notice what it says about the craft of shoemaking. The only craft little practiced among them was shoemaking. Shoemaking is not unknown among them. It's little practiced among them. So clearly, on a regular daily basis, hobbits tend not to wear shoes. In the days of their peace and prosperity, they were a merry folk. And we soon discover that their lives in the Shire are relatively easy, right? And the climate is mild. They don't wear a lot of shoes in their normal routine days, right? This does not mean that they never have footwear of any kind. The wearing of boots is definitely known. And exactly, Lisa, Tolkien's picture of Bilbo clearly wearing boots, which is up in the Misty Mountains. It's the picture that he painted for The Hobbit of Bilbo in the Eagle's Eyrie. And Bilbo is plainly wearing boots. The soles of your feet may be tough and leathery. That is not going to prevent your toes freezing off in the snow, right? That hobbits would wear boots in cold weather, and the snow and ice is almost certain. And probably in the farmyard, I'm thinking, right? I bet you that the hobbits who tend the well-tilled earth there in the Shire are very likely to have boots. Now, you're right, Starsha, that the lack of shoes does seem to kind of circle back to the stealth from the first paragraph, right? Definitely more sneaky. But anyway, yeah. So it's one of those things. There are many things, two of which are in this paragraph, that people have, that a lot of Tolkien readers and film watchers have kind of seized on and run with, and have kind of to the point where, again, if anyone were to depict or talk about a hobbit wearing shoes, people would yell at them. Like this happens in The Lord of the Rings Online, for instance. Like if you play a hobbit character and you wear boots, as one can do in the game, or at least outwardly appear cosmetically to be wearing boots, there's some people who get like offended and are like, you're a hobbit, you should be barefoot. You're not playing a real hobbit if you're not barefoot, right? And it's like, actually, like that's an exaggeration. They do, we just saw it there, right? That shoemaking is little practiced among them because they don't wear shoes all the time. Like I know, have no doubt they each own way fewer pairs of shoes on average than we do. But did they wear boots? Yeah, they did. I'm sure. We know they did. So again, that tends to get a little bit expanded. in people's mind. Also, the 6 meals a day thing. They are fond of 6 meals a day when they could get them. That does not mean hobbits always, like, religiously eat 6 meals a day, nor does it mean that hobbits are completely obsessed with food at all times. That projection onto hobbits, that is the projection that hobbits are completely just think about never think about anything but food, right? And are constantly focused on food, is a little bit strange. Yeah, a little bit. It's a little bit strange. I mean, it's not that there's no premise for it here in the text. They are fond of 6 meals a day. They do eat a lot, like we're told. The bringing up of young hobbits takes a lot of provender, right? But yes, the idea of hobbits as being like totally gluttonous, like just constantly obsessed with food, is that's hard. I've never been a big fan of the way that tends to get exaggerated, I think, in people's mind. Now, here's the charming thing for me. I find it charming that people are imagining hobbits eating 6 meals all the time, because basically that means they're kind of projecting the hobbits into this place of plenty and merriment, right? When they could get them, they were fond of 6 meals a day. Presumably, they can't get them not all of them can get them every day. So yeah, that's, imagining a world in which every hobbit can have 6 meals every day. That's a world hobbits would enjoy, no doubt, but not exactly the one that Tolkien describes. Yeah. And yes, Epic Kingdom, absolutely. Hobbits do not have large feet. They absolutely do not. The first depiction of hobbits with unusually large feet was from the illustrations of the brothers Hildebrand. Google it. Google Tolkien Brothers Hildebrand and see the images that you find. Many of them are hilarious. I am not a fan of almost anything painted by the brothers Hildebrand, actually. But they, I believe, were the first ones who chose to depict hobbits as having really big feet, which, by the way, makes no sense. It's hard to be deft and nimble with big, huge, honkin' flappy feet. And this was taken up within adaptations. The hobbits in the Rankin Bass Hobbit, like Bilbo in Rankin Bass Hobbit, has big feet. The hobbits, I'm pretty sure the hobbits in the Bakshi film have big feet. The hobbits, of course, then in Peter Jackson's films have big floppy feet, and the Harfoots in the Rings of Power have big floppy feet, and I hate them all. I hate all big floppy hobbit feet. I think it looks terrible. And not only is there no justification for it in the text, it is counter-indicated in the text. Yeah. So no, they do not have large feet. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, maybe they get hobbits confused with duffel puds. Yeah, maybe. Yeah, I'd have done things totally. Sean Astin might have liked how I would have done hobbit feet. But again, I also understand that, like, yeah, I would not do prosthetic feet for hobbits at all, frankly. If I were in charge of a film adaptation, I would not do prostheses for hobbit feet at all. I would put hair on the top of their feet, because we are told that the hair, and also like the hair on hobbit feet in most depictions and most adaptation depictions looks all like scraggly and nasty. Like it's like, I don't know, like somebody's leg hair just extended down to the toes. That is not what it is like. It's thick, like the hair on their head. Here, I think it looks dirty. I agree in most adaptations. I think the only adaptation that really gets this part right is the Rankin Bass. I think the Rankin Bass Hobbit, Bilbo's feet in the Rankin Bass Hobbit they're furry, like in just the right way, I think, if I'm remembering it correctly. Sorry, I just had a flashback remembering the greatest and most perfect Hobbit feet in all visual adaptations were in the Soviet Fellowship of the Ring. I'm kidding, of course. Those were hilarious. Everything about that is hilarious. But anyhow, here he is. Okay, thank you for the link there, JJ. That's a low resolution image, but anyway, you can see there's his furry feet. That's right. That's good. I like it. Matches his hair, right? Yep. Furry feet. Feet with fur you can brush. Yep. There you go. But look how big they are. His feet, like from heel to toe, are like as long as his legs from heel to hip, right? Way too big and flappy, but whatever. Okay, anyway. All right, so he does look like a proper grocer. I agree. Okay. Notice the emphasis at beginning and end of this paragraph is on the merriment of the hobbits, right? In the days of their peace and prosperity, they were a merry folk. And we end with their hospitableness and delight in parties and in presents. And of course, their laughter. Mouths apt to laughter and to eating and drinking. And laugh they did, and eat and drink, often and heartily. So they are a happy and cheerful people as a whole. This, I think, is really a very important piece of context that we're given leading into chapter 1, right? Hobbits are not struggling. They are cheerful in large part because they have an easy life in the Shire. We are getting the story of them in the days of their peace and prosperity. And that's what we're being told to prepare ourselves for here, right? The mere fact that they do at times, at least, eat 6 meals a day tells us something about the prosperity in which they live. That is certainly not something that can just be assumed, right? In the world in general, right? In Middle-earth in general. So I think that's really important. Okay, let's keep going. It is plain indeed that in spite of later estrangement, hobbits are relatives of ours, far nearer to us than elves, or even than dwarves. Of old they spoke the languages of men, after their own fashion, and liked and disliked much the same things as men did. But what exactly our relationship is can no longer be discovered. The beginning of hobbits lies far back in the elder days that are now lost and forgotten. Only the elves still preserve any records of that vanished time, and their traditions are concerned almost entirely with their own history, in which men appear seldom, and hobbits are not mentioned at all. Yet it is clear that hobbits had, in fact, lived quietly in Middle-earth for many long years before other folk became even aware of them. And the world being, after all, full of strange creatures beyond count, these little people seemed of very little importance. But in the days of Bilbo and of Frodo his heir, they suddenly became, by no wish of their own, both important and renowned, and troubled the counsels of the wise and great. Okay. hobbits are relatives of ours, far nearer to us than elves or even than dwarves. The or even than dwarves line is really interesting, isn't it, JJ? And I think the point there is that it's not that dwarves are really, really closely related to humans. It's that it would be easier for people to imagine that dwarves might be connected with humans than it would be for them to imagine being connected with elves. Anyone who has ever met an elf in Tolkien's world knows they're just different. They're not the same. They're not the same. I mean, again, even the apparent immortality by itself makes a huge difference, right? Dwarves live longer than humans do, but not that much longer than humans do. They're mortal, and they age like the same way that humans do. Again, slower, but in the same way. One can imagine people thinking, or at least speculating or wondering, right? Maybe dwarves and humans are related to each other, and there's some reason they're always short and always speak with a Scottish accent. But with elves, there's nobody in Tolkien's world who has met elves says, oh, maybe humans and elves, share the same origin and come from... No, they don't share the same origin and come from the same place, and that's very clear. So I think that's what he means there. There are more commonalities between humans and dwarves than there are between humans and elves, for sure. But humans and hobbits, much, much closer. Yeah. So, in spite of later estrangement, hobbits are relatives of ours. What exactly our relationship is can no longer be discovered. The beginning of hobbits lies far back in the elder days that are now lost and forgotten. Elder days, first age. So we know that the beginning of hobbits lies somewhere back in the first age, right? So he's putting the origin of hobbits back to the beginning times, right? The beginning times back when it's unknown exactly when. Does this mean during the first age? Does this mean before the sun arose? Presumably not, if they're related to men who awoke at the rising of the sun. So presumably after the rising of the sun, but sometime between the rising of the sun and the War of Wrath, hobbits began. Because that's what elder days means, right? Yeah. So Tolkien is explicit about the fact that hobbits have been around since the first age, at the least. How did it happen? Why did there come to be this sort of subspecies of humans, which is so different, and who then proceed in a totally different path? We don't know. It's lost and forgotten. I love the dig at elves here. Only the elves still preserve any records of that vanished time. Kudos to them for that. And their traditions are concerned almost entirely with their own history, in which men appear seldom and hobbits are not mentioned at all. Throwing shade at the elves here, right? Only the elves preserve any records of the elder days. Unfortunately, their records are pretty bad, right? Extremely selective, shall we say, right? There's some serious elvish burn right there. Yeah, exactly. Hobbits had, in fact, lived quietly in Middle-earth for many long years before other folk even became even aware of them. And nobody thought them particularly important. So when did it start? What happened? I don't know, right? I don't know. By the way, this is my own explanation. Like, based on what Tolkien, I can't this does not seem to be a thing that just happens. Tolkien never told the story, like the origin story of hobbits, in the same way that he tells the origin story of the dwarves, for instance, right? He never does that with hobbits. I have to think one of the Valar took a hand, like with the dwarves. Not in the same way as Aule. I'm not imagining somebody shaping hobbits, but maybe some kind of maybe some kind of blessing of hobbits by one of the Valar, right? That they were like, some, society of humans, some local group of humans who is sort of blessed in a particular way by one of the Valar. Nessa is my guess. Yeah, if I had to guess, Nessa or Nienna, one or the other, would be my. Those are my two guesses for which of the Valar are responsible for the hobbits. But we'll see. Who is the Valar of good food and partying? Tulkas. Yeah, clearly. I mean, if there's one of the Valar in charge of partying, it's obviously Tulkas. Obviously Tulkas, and Nessa is his wife. So that's what I'm saying. Like, it's, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Okay. So, what else? What did I want to emphasize here? Right, hobbits lived for many long years, the world being full of strange creatures without count. Tulkas is like the Macho Man Randy Savage was a hobbit. Okay. Okay. Yeah, Frodo, his heir. And notice, of course, we're reading this before we read page 1 of the book, right? But in the days of Bilbo and of Frodo, his heir, so somebody who hasn't read The Hobbit won't even recognize either of those two names, right? But that's okay. We're, if we enter page 1 with the names Bilbo and Frodo, his heir, in our heads, that'll only help because we're going to be introduced to both of them in that same way. So it's one of those examples where we can see, again, it's technically a spoiler, right? Troubled the counsels of the wise and great. Not exactly a spoiler, but some anticipation. Those days, the third age of Middle-earth, are now long past, and the shape of all lands has been changed. But the regions in which hobbits then lived were doubtless the same in which they still linger, the northwest of the old world, east of the sea. Of their original home, the hobbits in Bilbo's time preserved no knowledge. A love of learning, other than genealogical lore, was far from general among them, but there remained still a few in the older families who studied their own books and even gathered reports of old times and distant lands from elves, dwarves, and men. Their own records began only after the settlement of the Shire, and their most ancient legends hardly looked further back than their wandering days. It is clear nonetheless from these legends, and from the evidence of their peculiar words and customs, that like many other folk, hobbits had in the distant past moved westward. Their earliest tales seem to glimpse a time when they dwelt in the upper vales of Anduin, between the eaves of Greenwood the Great and the Misty Mountains. Why they later undertook the hard and perilous crossing of the mountains into Eriador is no longer certain. Their own accounts speak of the multiplying of men in the land, and of a shadow that fell on the forest, so that it became darkened, and its new name was Mirkwood. Okay. Great. The regions in which hobbits then lived were doubtless the same as those in which they still linger, referring back to that first paragraph in which we're firmly told that hobbits are still around today. But if you want to find one, you need to go to the northwest of the old world, which means pretty much the British Isles, but possibly other places in the northwest. East of the sea, of course. Of their original home, the hobbits in Bilbo's time preserved no knowledge. Their original home, meaning where hobbits awoke, where hobbits became hobbits, right? No memories of that. For the elves, to Cuivienen there is no returning. For the hobbits, they have no idea, right? They don't retain any memories at all about where they came from. I love the digression in the middle of their original home. A love of learning was far from general among them. There are not that many Hobbit scholars. unusual. He doesn't say it's, they're none, right? That there are no hobbits who have or develop a love of learning. Indeed, of course, we're going to see two very prominently in the story that we're about to start reading, right? Bilbo, of course, shows a great love of learning, as does his greatest pupil ever, right? Which is Sam, obviously, right? Who is going to continue the love of learning and become, a great teacher and continuer of their lore. Oh, hey, welcome, B-dubs. Great to have you with us. Anyway, so I was just having a conversation with Tom Hillman earlier this week, and we were talking about the evidence of writing technology in The Lord of the Rings, how we have books in the Shire, references to scrolls from earlier on, and although there is paper in the Third Age, we don't see paper earlier on. Everything from before are parchments. So you can see, they're like sort of consistent with real world technological development, or sort of parallel to real world development. James, is it possible hobbits came from further distant lands? Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. They tended to go generally westward, right? We're told, or maybe we're told that in the next paragraph. But yeah, they will eventually cross the mountains. But for sure, they started off further to the east than what will be Rohan, or even, up, farther north, where the Rohirrim came from, or the lands of Gondor. And that's normal. Almost everything comes from the east. Almost everything. Dwarves didn't come from the east, but men came from the east, elves came from the east. Everybody sort of starts out over there. So their earliest tales seem to glimpse a time when they dwelt in the upper vales of the Anduin. And that, James, is your reference there to the distant connection with the ancestors of the men of Rohan, right? Where we get the Hobbit-themed connection. By the way, this is why I've heard people ask why the Hobbit characters in the Rings of Power series are not called hobbits, why they're called Harfoots instead. We're going to get to the Harfoots, of course, in the next paragraph. But there's a good reason why the word hobbit should not be invented yet, because Tolkien invented an etymology for the word hobbit, that hobbits call themselves hobbits and have for a long time, but presumably only since the time when they lived in the upper vales of the Anduin, where they were given the name Hobbit-themed by the ancestors of the Rohirrim, which word means hole builders, right? They're the builders of holes. And of course, the Harfoots in the Ring of Power don't live in holes. Nobody would ever call them Hobbit-themed because they don't build holes. They're nomadic, right? They're at least migratory. The time in which the Harfoots are journeying in the Rings of Power show predates the time when the name Hobbit-themed was attached to the hobbits, because they had not yet developed the pattern of dwelling in holes. So that's actually very, very consistent. Notice, by the way, in passing, the reference to their wandering days here. Which is, of course, a relevant little nugget when we turn to thinking about the Rings of Power depiction. But one more paragraph, and then we will. Before the crossing of the mountains, the hobbits had already become divided into three somewhat different breeds: Harfoots, Stoors, and Falahides. The Harfoots were browner of skin, smaller, and shorter, and they were beardless and bootless. Their hands and feet were neat and nimble, and they preferred highlands and hillsides. The stores were broader, heavier in build, their feet and hands were larger, and they preferred flat lands and riversides. The Falahides were fairer of skin and also of hair, and they were taller and slimmer than the others. They were lovers of trees and of woodlands. And by the way, I believe that even store feet are not as large as hobbit feet tend to be depicted. No, Hobbitlan is actually from Old English. That's not Welsh. It's Old English. Which, of course, Tolkien was one of the foremost scholars of in his time. The Hobbitlan. That's why I'm saying Byt, because the B, it's Holbytlan, but the Y in Old English is pronounced Y, like the, not oo, but Y. We don't really do that sound in modern English anymore, but that's which is why the flower that grows in Rohan is called Symbolmune in their tongue, not Symbolmuna or Symbolmina or something like that. It's Symbolmune in the language of the Anglo-Saxons, which was Old English. Anyway. So the Hobbitlan is the pronunciation of the old word for hobbits. So they had become divided into three somewhat different breeds. Now, nobody should be surprised by this. What are we thinking of, right? Anybody, certainly anybody who knows about Tolkien's stories, right? Now, keep in mind, this included nobody who read this prologue originally, right, in the 1950s, because the Silmarillion hadn't been published yet. But of course, this is kind of a thing. We can see how in Tolkien's mind there was a parallel here between the hobbits and the elves. Not, again, they're not connected, they're not identical, right? But there's a parallel between the two. Just as there were three primary kindred among the elves, right? There are three kindreds of the hobbits here as well: the Harfoots, the Stores, and the Falahides. And we see that the distinguishing characteristics of these three families is expressed in their kind of cultural preferences, right? Like where they choose to live. Stores live in the flatlands and the riversides and mess about with boats on rivers and that kind of thing. The Falahides are taller and fairer of skin and of hair, right? So if you see a taller, light-haired hobbit, is likely to have be of a strong Falahidish strain, whereas the Harfoots are smaller, shorter, browner of skin, and beardless and bootless. Notice the fact that he includes the word bootless tells you that other hobbits tended to wear boots more often than the Harfoots did, doesn't it? Yep. Why even say that they are bootless if all hobbits are bootless all the time? And yes, Coldeshell, you're right. The three houses of men too. There's the three primary families. Now, it's not exactly the same. It's not directly parallel in the sense that with the elves and the hobbits, like all of them are sort of subdivided into these three kindreds. Right. Like all of the elves in the west of the world are originally from one of those three groups, right? Just as all of the hobbits, come from one of these three groups, which then seem to mingle together later on to make the later hobbits of the Third Age. Unlike the elves, they don't remain distinct. With the humans, there were the three families of the Edain, right? But those are just like descendants of three particular people, right? It's not like, and all of humans were divided into 3 kindreds. It's not like that at all. So it's not exactly parallel in that way, but nevertheless, you're right. There are 3 important sort of clans among the Edain. And so therefore we do have a kind of parallel there in that way. James is wondering, is that divide an intentional parallel to traits commonly associated with? Yeah, exactly. So that the Falahides are kind of like elves, the Stores are kind of like dwarves. And I think it's the other way around. I think that the Harfoots are the ones that are associated with dwarves, even though they're beardless. But and then the Stores, I think, would be associated with men. So like vaguely, right? Vaguely. Sort of roughly parallel, but I don't think he doesn't seem to be sort of leaning hard onto that exact parallel. Though I would say the sort of elfinness of the Falahides is fairly pronounced. That's where the Tooks come from. And so a Falahidish Took taking a fairy wife is a little bit less absurd, perhaps, than a Harfoot or Stoor marrying an elf. Awesome. Okay, so Spartan, I would love to believe that the references to Stoors having larger hands and feet than the other 2 kinds is the inspiration for the brothers Hildebrand, which started this whole hideous hobbits have enormous feet trend. But I doubt it. I am doubtful. I'm doubtful that I shall effectively be able to comfort myself in that way. Okay. So, what do we know? Let's turn now to thinking about the Rings of Power depiction of the Harfoots and where the Harfoots are coming from and how the show is positioning the Second Age Harfoots in relationship to the Hobbits as Tolkien introduces them here, which is explicitly an introduction to the Third Age Hobbits at the beginning of The Lord of the Rings. Awesome. Oh, hey, Minty, welcome. So glad you could be here live. You started watching Exploring the Lord of the Rings on July 27th. Oh, man, and you're on 122 already? Whew. Boy, that is... you probably listened to it at more than 1x, in which case I probably sound kind of weird to you talking in my normal pace right now. But that is strong work right there. You'll catch up with us in no time. My suggestion, by the way, Minty, is what I would do if I were catching up with Exploring the Lord of the Rings, is I would come to the live classes right away, and then in between times, catch up, as you come through, so that one of the Exploring the Lord of the Rings you listen to every week can be the current one, right? And then go back and do the other ones until you catch up. That's what I would suggest, because that way you can participate you don't have to wait to participate in the live discussions, and you'll catch up with us. It's not hard to go faster than we're going. But anyway, just a suggestion. Okay, so let's talk about the show. And I'm not going to spend too long talking about this because I talk about this in lots of other times and places. But I just wanted to think about the choices, the adaptation choices that have been made. Thinking about, again, the way we've been introduced to Harfoot society and its connections to this whole long passage we've been reading from Concerning Hobbits. The first thing, of course, I'm reading all the chats. David Pirtle, yeah. I'm reading all the. I see you there on Twitch, and Minty Scales on YouTube, and a couple folks. Starsha was on Facebook before, and yeah, I've got all the chats. So I'm trying to follow them all at once, which is sometimes a little complicated. But anyway, so we can remember where Tolkien begins in his explanation of hobbits, and that is their elusiveness, right? And obviously this is the very first implication, right? The very first idea of that we see with the Harfoots and their skill at hiding, right? In fact, I couldn't help but think about the Harfoots all the way through this first paragraph when we were thinking about them. The only difference, of course, is the good-tilled earth, right? A well-ordered and well-farmed countryside is not yet the favorite haunt of the Harfoots. So there we can see how in the show because they're several thousand years earlier than the Shire hobbits that are being introduced here. We're going to get the Shire. We're going to start our story in the well-ordered and well-farmed countryside of the Shire, right? Which is why Tolkien is introducing us to this. They are imagining back to the wandering days, right? Long before the hobbits settled in the Shire. And so long before they even started digging holes in the ground to live in or anything like that, right? The neat and nimble? Yeah, exactly. Well, it's true. Nimble except when breaking an ankle, but that was unusual, right? That was exactly sort of the problem there. Like the fact that he can no longer be nimble is a big part of the issue there. Anyway, so this is one of the main things that I have really loved about, so clearly when they're depicting hobbits in the show, they want to have some continuity, right? They want to show the connection between these creatures that we're seeing here in the show and the hobbits that we know in The Lord of the Rings. And one of the very first things that they do is to emphasize the elusiveness, right? How hard they are to see and how easy they are to overlook. And that's, of course, the very way that we're introduced to them the first time they appear in the show, with those hunters coming through, not seeing the entire village of Harfoots that are right nearby them there. And I think that's a really, really great choice for how to introduce them. And of course, the particular way in which they do with their camouflage and the plants in their hair and everything, the extensive, it's not just we can move silently and we know how to hide, right? Their entire sort of setup, a very large percentage of their material culture, right? That is like the stuff that they make, clothing, tools, decorations, right, are focused on camouflage. And that reflects who they are and where they are, right? Hiding is their number one response. It was one of my favorite little moments in episode 3, right? When the stranger blunders into the party, right, at the end, and they all hide. Right. So, we look up and we see he's looking for Nori and he calls out to Nori and we see her face like right above there. And at first it looks like she's alone. Right. And then all they're all right there. Right. And they all come out of hiding. Kind of loved that. Right. This sort of glimpse of when they possessed from the first the art of disappearing swiftly and silently when large folk whom they do not wish to meet come blundering by, and this art they have developed until to men it may seem magical, right? I was thinking of that sentence. I had that sentence kind of running through my head when I was watching that portion of episode 3 before. And you're right, JJ, he didn't quite make a noise like elephants, as the narrator in The Hobbit says, but it was pretty close. So anyway, so this is clearly the first place where they began, right? The size, it would have been interesting. It would have been possible. It would have been consistent with what Tolkien says, for the show to have chosen to depict hobbits that were basically human size, maybe a little shorter, like 5 feet or something. Could have happened. He says they've dwindled, they say, and in ancient days they were taller. Now they're 2 to 4 feet tall, but they used to be taller. And I don't think we can read the 2 and 4 feet, meaning like in the ancient days they were 4 feet tall, but they've since diminished to only 2 feet. Because of course 4'5" is Bolroar, and Merry and Pippin are going to be taller than 4'5", right? So it is not only the ancient hobbits of the earlier days that were fully 4 feet tall. They used to be even taller. So actually, they could have depicted like 5-foot hobbits, like a little bit shorter, right, than the rest of the cast. They didn't have to do the whole scale thing. In the show, they've decided to retain that. I think that's a really good choice. Again, that sentence would justify basically human-sized hobbits. I don't think anybody watching the show could possibly have gotten over it if they did, right? Howsoever consistent it may be with what Tolkien said, I cannot imagine that audiences could reconcile themselves to hobbits that were not hobbit-sized. Anyway, so I think that I think that so they've chosen just to make the hobbits relatively stable in size, and we can see the proportions between like the Harfoots and the stranger, for instance. No, we don't know exactly. We've never seen the stranger standing next to another human or elf, right? So we don't know exactly how tall he is. Anyway, yeah. Exactly. James says, I'd have lost my mind on instinct. I think it would have been completely jarring all the time, completely jarring. No sentence by Tolkien could possibly have justified it. So I think, and I like how they leaned into that, right? Like them talking about giants, right? Though calling humans Bigfoots seems a little rich to my way of thinking, as it's not the humans with the ginormous feet, but whatever. Now, here is another place where we can see in the Rings of Power show, them choosing some deliberate connections with hobbits and hobbit culture that we know, while introducing some significant differences, because they have to be very different. They can't be identical. We can't be meeting a hobbit culture that looks exactly the same. I think the way that they're imagining these ancestral hobbits, I think it's important for there to be differences, right? And so here, notice, in the days of their peace and prosperity, they were a merry folk. Well, they're nowhere near the days of their peace and prosperity yet. The Harfoots are not living in either peace or prosperity. They are living in a dangerous world, and they are not prosperous. There is, they have to be looking out for where their next meal comes from. Now, notice, though, there is still this kind of abandon, right? Mouths apt to laughter and to eating and drinking is one of the very first things that we see about them, right? Remember, the opening sequence for our introduction to Harfoots in the Rings of Power show is first with the hiding, right, with the camouflage when those hunters go by, and then it's Nori leading the juvenile expedition out to the blackberry patch, right? Where we see much laughter and much eating and drinking going on. Well, mostly eating, right, going on out there. And they laugh, they did, and eat and drink often and heartily. You can see the consistency, right? You can see where that tendency, that dynamic is still there in the hobbits, even though they're not living in plenty. And of course, there's this tension introduced there in episode 1 with the fact that Nori actually was putting all of the children into danger, going outside the bounds of where they knew was safe. And as indeed we see, there was a wolf right there, right? So that could nearly have ended in tragedy, right? So certainly, as indeed we know happens, right? We learn in episode 3 that the Harfoot who is presumably Sadoc's wife, what was her name? Daffodil Burrows, right? Was killed by wolves, right? So this is a thing that happens, and yet they do have a tendency to laugh and eat and drink often and heartily. I don't know how many meals a day they eat. I doubt they eat 6 meals a day, but they certainly delight in parties. We don't see presents yet, I think. I don't think we've seen any evidence of presents, unless I missed something. But certainly delight in parties. Here, though, you see the parties are organized around their migratory patterns, right? This is clearly a seasonal festival that they're holding there in episode 3, right before the migration, right before they leave. And yes, James, all of Poppy's family is dead. Poppy is an orphan. That's also gently made explicit in episode 3, when we get the names of all of the people with her same last name. Proudfellow, isn't it? Proudfellow, her last name? And we get this long list of Proudfellows. What sounds like the husband and wife and 3 children. And then, of course, we see Poppy weeping as she's listening to the catalog of their names, especially the names of all of her siblings. Now, Starsha, you're right. We do get the giving of food, right? Nori coming back and giving blackberry to her mom and her dad, right? Not to mention, of course, the gift of the snails that she brings for the stranger, right, the next day. I agree, Spartan. I think that does count. I think that does count because it shows the inclination, right? Nori, especially, is very willing to keep secrets from her parents, right? But even when she sneaks out to the blackberry patch where she's not supposed to go, she still gives blackberries to her parents, right? Right, exactly. Yes, Nathan, you're right. Poppy is an adopted orphan, like Frodo. Yeah. We don't see the memory of Frodo's orphaning, right, the loss of his family, is not as prominently emphasized in The Lord of the Rings as we got with Poppy there in episode 3. But yeah. Okay. Now, skipped one quickly there. Their origins. Now, here is where we hear about them heading west, and this, of course, this is the passage that concerned a lot of people when they were talking about Harfoots being in the show at all. So far, absolutely nothing in the show which is not consistent with everything here. But keep in mind that sentence that we read carefully before, and think about what it means. Only the elves still preserve any records of that vanished time, and their traditions are concerned almost entirely with their own history, in which men appear seldom and hobbits are not mentioned at all. We were talking about how that's like throwing shade at the elves, right? It is true that there exist no stories of anything that hobbits did in the Second Age. That does not mean that hobbits never did anything in the Second Age. It just means they didn't make the histories. And whose fault is that? The people who wrote the histories. That's who, right? And they themselves don't retain any cultural stories, any memories. They didn't, they don't retain anything until they were living in the Upper Anduin, right? Well after, which would have been in the Third Age, well into the Third Age, presumably. Oh, Nathan, and you're absolutely right. Nathan Dessenville, that the Hobbit hospitality is definitely displayed by Nori, right? Her sense of her, that the stranger is important and that taking care of him is important in some way. But yeah, her hospitality, right? Her hosting of the stranger, making the shelter for him, bringing him food, does really kind of seem to fit that whole Hobbit picture as well. But anyway, yeah. So lots of people, and this, of course, it was always hard for me to tell. One of the things that I strongly dislike most about all of the people who spend so much of their time complaining about the Rings of Power to try to keep people from liking it, which is just like the worst hobby I can think of, to try to not like something and try to convince everybody else not to like it either. But anyway, a lot of those people have their minds completely made up and are just looking for excuses, right? And so it's hard to take that seriously. But there are, of course, many people who are Tolkien readers who are just like, themselves concerned or confused about the same things. And it's very hard to tell them apart. So I have a difficult time with this. This is the thing that is most vexing to me about the trolls, is that it's hard to see, like, make out the earnest Tolkien students from the mere trolls. But in any case, there were a lot of people who were sort of making this sentence sound as if Tolkien had said hobbits definitely didn't exist in the Second Age, or that they didn't do anything at all. Of course they did things, right? And indeed, again, I think that there's just an undercurrent of resentment in this sentence, right? That, had somebody besides the elves been writing the stories of the earlier ages, there might be more hobbits in them, right? Yeah. I wonder if it's possible, too, that Numenor had records of the hobbits that were lost in the fall. It's another thing to remember, Nicholas, is that lots and lots of things are just forgotten, right? Are just lost. There are, again, many people have said, like, so the Harfoots in the show, like, it'll break the lore if they accomplish anything significant. That's not true. All that has to happen is that any record of their accomplishing anything needs to be lost, right? And even if the two people that we know are going to be surviving into the later Third Age, namely Galadriel and Elrond, even if they come to know of what the Harfoots did, that doesn't mean that they necessarily wrote it down. I have a prediction. I'm going to make a prediction right now. I predict that somebody, probably Elrond, possibly Galadriel, maybe both, will meet the Harfoots before the end and come to know of what they did. But there is going to be a reason why they are going to agree. Perhaps they're going to even be asked not to tell anybody about what the Harfoots did. I think there's going to be a deliberate choice of secrecy, presumably in order to permit the Harfoots to continue their under-the-radar existence that they've been living. I bet you that that's going to be an explicit plot point somewhere at the end of season 5. A little prediction I'm gonna make right there. So anyway, okay. We will see. Oh yeah, James, absolutely. The loss of the Library of Alexandria is like nothing compared to the fall of Numenor. Oh my goodness, so much was lost, right? So much lore lost at the fall of Numenor. That would be the other thing. Like, what I expect to happen is that, like, they're going to find, people are going to know about what the Harfoots did and are going to, like, deliberately not talk about it. The second coolest thing would be if at some point somebody is like, I am going to write the definitive history of the Harfoots, right? And I'm going to store it securely right here in this library in Numenor. Yep, exactly. Okay. Then, of course, we've got the Homes of the Hobbits and the Wandering Days. I love how they've taken on that. They've taken that, the show has taken that phrase, the Wandering Days of the Hobbits, right? And they've made it literal. This is, to me, so typical of what, of how they've been proceeding in the Rings of Power, right? So they have the concept. We want to depict the ancestral hobbits, right? The hobbits thousands of years before. So way before the culture of the Shire. So what would their culture have been like? It could have been one of a bunch of things, right? What might it have been like? How can we know? So they come here and they're like, they're wandering days. There we go. They were wanderers, right? So they take like a hint contained in that phrase and they develop it into a story, right? They develop it into the culture of the Harfoots and find those ways to link it, to root it in the same, to make those connections with how Tolkien describes hobbits, and yet preserve it as something different, something clearly sort of culturally prior to the Shire, right? Really, really fun. And then, of course, we have the reference to the Harfoots. Why are they called Harfoots and not Hobbits? I talked already about why they're not called Hobbits in the show. Why are they called Harfoots? Because these are the ancestors of the Harfoots. These are one of the three kindreds of hobbits back when those kindreds were still more distinct. Oh, yeah, the Harfoots, which were browner of skin than the rest of the hobbits. Yes, indeed. Gosh, it's almost like... even within Tolkien's lore, the casting of people with browner skin as hobbits in the show is perfectly justified by the text. But anyway, again, I don't think we're going to get... no, they preferred highlands and hillsides, right? We're going to see. I'm going to be interested in where they go. There are two things that I'm hoping to see, or learn about at least, in episode 5, which is dropping in a little under 2 hours. Number one is more Gil-galad, please. Definitely more Gil-galad. I now have multiple reasons why I want to see more Gil-galad. I've been wanting that anyway ever since episode 1. And of course, Maggie and I are interviewing Benjamin Walker, who plays Gil-galad, in our Twitter show on Friday afternoon. So I would love to see more Gil-galad to talk about. But the other thing that I really want to see, I want to know where the Harfoots are migrating to. What land? I just want to know where they're going. So anyway, yeah, there's a grove. It's a grove. There's trees there. That's literally all we know, right, about the other place that they're headed to. So that suggests to me the general Mirkwoodian direction, right? It made me wonder, thinking about trees and where I'm hoping for Ents too, Nathan. Absolutely, I'm hoping for Ents. So here's what I'm wondering. Do you think the grove that they're heading off to is going to be anywhere near the future Dol Guldur area in southern Mirkwood? Because from the map, that looked likely to me. Anyway, just saying, it'd be interesting. I wonder if we're gonna get there. I doubt all the way to the Upper Anduin, Amin-Moto. That's too far. And anyway, it's going to be much later. Like, they're going to settle in the Upper Anduin, in like Third Age, right? But which I guess is not all that far in the future from the time of the show, but still, yeah, we'll see. So Southern Mirkwood is kind of where I'm expecting they're migrating to, but I want to see more. I want to see if it's anywhere near Amon Hlunk, which is the name of the hill before it becomes Dol Guldur. So we'll see. Who knows? No, they're not sending the Harfoots to Isengard. I doubt that, though that would be particularly amusing. Yeah, no, that is Naked Hill. The Amon Hlunk is the Naked Hill. So I don't think that's the grove they're talking about, obviously. But all I would need is just to see. I would love it if I could see Amon Hlunk, right, if in the background or whatever. I don't know. Anyway, I'm just saying. I'll be interested to see if that's the area they're going to. I'll be interested to find out. Okay, but yes, the interaction with the Ents, we will see. Okay, I gotta go, however, because it is now 10:15 p.m. Eastern time, and I need to go check in with my family before my next broadcast, which will be in an hour and 45 minutes when said episode 5 drops, and we can watch together. You can join us on the Twitch channel. So I'm broadcasting this on Twitch and YouTube and a couple other places. The watch party is just going to be on Twitch. So if you join us at twitch.tv/SignumU, you can join us for the watch party. I'll be there. I think actually Maggie might be able to join us for the watch party live tonight. Hopefully, we'll see. So you might get reactions from both me and Maggie as we watch for the first time. And then afterwards, I'll do a brief discussion as I'm processing episode 5. And then I'll have to go so I can prep for Friday. But anyhow, family time first, and then back at midnight for our watch party on Twitch. And yes, I am indeed coming to Denver tomorrow, Finrod. So excited. So yes, I got watch party at midnight, and then prep, and then a little bit of sleep, and then noon p.m., 12 p.m. noon Eastern time, the Twitter Spaces show with me and Maggie, and we're interviewing Benjamin Walker, who plays Gil-galad. And then as soon as that's done, I am dashing to the airport, Finrod, so that I can come out to Denver and hang out with folks at Mountain Moot this weekend. So there we go. That's the plan for like the next 16 hours. Happy Hobbit Day, everybody. Thanks for joining me. This was a lot of fun. And I will see some of you, hopefully, in a little bit less than 2 hours. So see you guys. Bye now.